Pacific Ocean, 1946. The sea is calm for the first time in years. Dawn light drifts across gray steel hulls anchored in still water, lines of destroyers, weathered by salt, smoke, and time. Their guns, once alive with thunder, now stand mute beneath seagulls circling overhead. A boatswain's whistle cuts through the quiet as crews repaint hull numbers faded by war. Men who once chased submarines across the Atlantic now chip rust and polish brass in peacetime routines. Their ships, forged for battle, now sit idle, symbols of a power that no longer has an enemy. In nearby shipyards, welding torches flicker as some vessels are stripped for scrap. Others await refit orders that never come. Radio towers crackle with new words: demobilization, budget cuts, post-war surplus. But beneath that calm, the world is already shifting. New powers rise, new fears awaken, and the ocean, once ruled by guns, begins to whisper of something different: radar, jet aircraft, and the invisible hunt beneath the waves. The destroyer, that lean, gun-heavy hunter of the Second World War, stands at a crossroads. Its glory is fading, but its story is far from over. August 1945. The guns fall silent across two oceans. The most destructive war in history ends not with a final battle, but with an atomic flash over Japan. As fleets return home, the world's greatest navies face a paradox: unmatched power, and no one left to fight. For the United States Navy, the end of World War II brings both triumph and crisis. In the span of just 4 years, it has grown from a coastal defense force to an oceanic empire. Nearly 1,200 destroyers serve across the globe, from the tin can veterans of the early Pacific campaigns to the sleek, radar-equipped Fletcher, Allen, Sumner, and Gearing classes. They are fast, heavily armed, and battle-proven. But in 1946, they suddenly have no mission. Men line the rails of ships returning to San Diego, Norfolk, and Pearl Harbor. Some cry, some cheer, all uncertain of what comes next. Within months, tens of thousands of sailors are demobilized. Shipyards that once operated around the clock now echo with silence. Dry docks fill not with new hulls, but with decommissioned destroyers waiting for the scrap torch. Across the Atlantic, the Royal Navy faces the same reckoning. Britain, exhausted by 6 years of total war, begins dismantling its empire and its fleet. Destroyers that had fought through the North Atlantic storms and Mediterranean convoys are paid off, sold, or left to rust in cold harbors. The world that built them no longer exists. Yet even as peace settles in, unease lingers. The alliance that defeated Hitler begins to fracture almost immediately. By 1946, relations between the United States and the Soviet Union are deteriorating. Winston Churchill warns of an Iron Curtain descending across Europe. The Cold War has begun, and with it, a new kind of uncertainty. Naval planners in Washington, London, and Tokyo realize something chilling: victory has not ended competition at sea. It has only changed its nature. The battles of the future will not be fought with torpedoes and deck guns alone. They will be decided by radar, sonar, jet aircraft, and atomic weapons. But in 1946, no one knows what that means for the destroyer. Once the hunter-killer of the fleet, its role seems to evaporate. Carriers dominate the horizon, submarines slip beneath it, and the great battleships that destroyers once guarded are themselves being retired. Some naval officers argue that destroyers are obsolete, relics of a pre-atomic age. Others, more cautious, warn that the sea always finds a new enemy. Still, the evidence seems clear: the world has moved on. The United States mothballs hundreds of destroyers in reserve fleets, lines of gray hulls moored together, sealed, and left to slumber beneath tarpaulins. In Philadelphia, Bremerton, and Charleston, these ghost fleets stretch for miles, each ship a memory of war frozen in time. The Japanese Navy, stripped of its empire, no longer exists. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, studies captured German technology, radar, sonar, and torpedo innovations to shape its own vision of naval warfare. Though the Red Fleet remains small, its ambitions are vast. Quietly, in Leningrad and Severodvinsk, Soviet engineers begin laying down the hulls of new destroyers, sleeker, faster, built for a different kind of fight. And so, between 1945 and 1948, the world's oceans become strangely quiet. The thunder of naval gunfire fades, replaced by the hum of peacetime industry and the distant test blasts of atomic bombs. The destroyer, once the cutting edge of naval warfare, drifts into limbo, too small to dominate, too important to forget. Yet change is coming. The silence will not last. In just a few years, new enemies, new technologies, and a new war will pull these ships and their weary crews back into action. By 1948, the world had entered a new kind of tension, a peace so fragile it felt temporary. The atomic bomb had redrawn military logic overnight, and every navy now faced the same question. What good was a warship in an age when a single weapon could erase a city? For the destroyer, survival meant reinvention. In Washington, the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships began a quiet transformation. Engineers studied wartime lessons, from kamikaze strikes to U-boat wolf packs, and asked how a destroyer could fight not just surface targets, but invisible threats. The answer lay in electronics. Radar had been the destroyer's greatest wartime advantage. Now it became its salvation. Massive new radar masts rose above Gearing-class destroyers, giving them eyes that could see hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. Some were stripped of torpedo tubes to make room for radar arrays and radio rooms, converted into radar picket destroyers, the watchmen of the atomic fleet. Their task was simple and terrifying: to sail far ahead of carrier groups, alone, to detect incoming bombers or missiles, and die first if necessary. The sea, once dominated by gunfire, had turned into a world of invisible signals. At the same time, the underwater threat was evolving fast. The Soviet Union, using captured German research, began producing advanced diesel-electric submarines based on the feared Type XXI. Western admirals realized that submarine warfare was not gone, it was about to return in deadlier form. Destroyers, once hunters of surface ships, now became guardians against the unseen. New sonar systems, the QHB, later SQS series, turned the sea into an acoustic battlefield. Depth charges gave way to head-throwing mortars like the Hedgehog and Squid, allowing ships to attack submarines before they could strike. In Portsmouth, British designers experimented with the Daring-class, sleek, fast destroyers armed with rapid-firing 4.5-inch guns and advanced radar systems. The Royal Navy envisioned them as gun destroyers for the jet age, combining the lessons of the Atlantic War with the demands of the Cold War. They would be the last and finest examples of traditional naval gunnery before missiles took command. Across the Pacific, the newly formed Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, operating under U.S. guidance, began with hand-me-downs. Former American destroyers, refitted and reflagged, formed the backbone of Japan's post-war navy. They were symbols of rebirth, but also of dependence. The age of global navies had become an American-led order. Meanwhile, American shipyards cautiously reawakened. The Forrest Sherman class began to take shape on drawing boards, not yet built, but already imagined. These new destroyers would be leaner, cleaner, and designed from the keel up for radar-directed gunfire and anti-submarine warfare. They represented the bridge between the gun era and the missile age. Yet for all this modernization, many sailors felt the world slipping away from them. The camaraderie of the gun crews, the roar of salvos, the smell of cordite, it was all being replaced by screens, signals, and silence. The destroyer, once defined by its thunder, now fought wars it could neither see nor hear. And in the background, the oceans themselves were changing. The Arctic convoys were gone, the Pacific Island bases silent. But the Soviet Navy was expanding, its submarines probing deeper into the Atlantic, its reconnaissance planes shadowing carrier groups. Tensions over Berlin and Korea were rising. The Cold War was no longer theoretical. It was becoming physical. By 1950, the world's destroyers had new eyes, new ears, and new missions. But they were still ships of steel and gunpowder, relics caught between two eras. Then, in June 1950, the illusion of peace shattered. North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel, and once again, the destroyers of the world's navies were ordered to war. The next 3 years would prove one thing beyond doubt: that the age of the gun was not yet over. 1. The technological angle, the last evolution of steel and gunfire. In the decade after 1945, naval technology advanced faster than in any period before it. Yet for destroyers, progress was not about building bigger guns, it was about survival through adaptation. World War II had proven that a destroyer's value lay in its versatility. But the Cold War demanded more: radar sensitivity, sonar range, electronic warfare. In this new order, visibility equaled death, and the first to see was the first to strike. Shipyards turned to modernization. Old Fletchers and Gearings received Mark 25 and Mark 37 fire control systems, capable of locking onto aircraft and guiding anti-aircraft shells with radar precision. Dual-purpose 5-inch/38 guns, once the weapon of choice against surface and air targets, were pushed to their limits. Their mounts were automated, their elevation speeds doubled, and their fuses timed by proximity detectors. But radar pickets marked the true frontier. Towering masts, massive dish antennas, and electronic cabins filled every spare space aboard. What had once been a hunter's deck was now a flying sensor array, capable of warning entire task forces minutes before an airstrike. The problem was weight. These upgrades strained hulls designed for a different age. Older destroyers rolled heavily, burned fuel quickly, and required constant maintenance. By 1949, it was clear that post-war destroyers needed not just new systems, they needed new bones. The designs that followed, Forrest Sherman in the US, Daring in Britain, represented the peak of gun destroyer design. Fast, radar-integrated, capable of independent operations, they were masterpieces of naval engineering. And yet, even as their keels were laid, whispers of missiles and atomic-powered ships signaled the coming end of everything they stood for. 2. The tactical angle, from wolf packs to umbrellas. During World War II, destroyers fought in packs, swift and aggressive, darting between carriers and battleships, chasing submarines, and charging into torpedo attacks. But post-war doctrine demanded something colder: endurance, coordination, and distance. The enemy had changed. There were no fleets to duel, no convoys to guard. Instead, destroyers faced nuclear bombers, long-range submarines, and atomic strike carriers that could not afford to be surprised. Tactics evolved into layers. The destroyer was now part of an early warning umbrella. Pickets extended hundreds of miles ahead, linked by radio nets and radar. They detected threats long before the main fleet could. In practice, it meant long, lonely patrols. A destroyer cutting through heavy seas in the North Pacific, its radar scanning an empty sky, its crew on edge for hours that turned into days. Anti-submarine tactics also matured. No longer a reactive chase, it became a science of detection and geometry. Ships used sonar triangulation and attack patterns coordinated by radio, an orchestra of sound and depth charges. The destroyer became the center of ASW groups, escorted by aircraft equipped with magnetic anomaly detectors and sonobuoys. What had once been a visceral, visual fight was now an invisible duel of pings, echoes, and guesses. Still, the spirit of the destroyer, fast, daring, aggressive, remained. The men who commanded these ships still trusted instinct as much as technology. A sonar echo could be false. A blip on the radar could be a storm. The line between confidence and catastrophe was as thin as it had been in 1942. 3. The leadership angle, admirals, engineers, and the fear of obsolescence. At the Pentagon, debates grew heated. The admirals who had fought in the Pacific were divided. Some, like Admiral Arleigh Burke, then an influential strategist, believed destroyers must evolve into multi-role ships with advanced electronics and stronger ASW capability. Others argued for a focus on carriers and submarines, calling surface destroyers relics of the past. Burke, an engineer at heart, saw something others missed. Destroyers were the connective tissue of the fleet. They relayed information, hunted silently, and fought where larger ships could not go. Without them, carrier groups were blind and vulnerable. In Britain, First Sea Lord Bruce Fraser faced the same dilemma with fewer resources. Post-war austerity forced the Royal Navy to choose between modernization and reduction. The Daring class became his answer, a class meant to prove that traditional destroyers could still hold relevance in the jet and radar age. Even within shipyards, leadership mattered. Engineers had to merge old technologies with new systems never designed for the same spaces. Power distribution, radar cooling, crew accommodations, every decision shaped the destroyer's survival. The men leading this transformation were not headline heroes. They were problem solvers in steel, cables, and blueprints. They carried the war's memory but also the responsibility to prepare for a war no one yet understood. By 1950, the destroyer's identity had changed, no longer a frontline attacker, but a guardian, a sentinel, and a testbed for technologies that would define the next half-century. And just as these changes began to settle, war returned, and theory became reality once again. For the enemy and threat angle, the red tide below the waves. While the Western fleets demobilized, another navy was quietly preparing. In the cold shipyards of the Soviet North, where ice clung to unfinished hulls and the air tasted of oil and coal smoke, the next great maritime rivalry was already forming. The Soviet Navy emerged from the Second World War with little surface strength, but with something far more dangerous: knowledge. Captured German engineers and blueprints from the U-boat program fueled an underwater revolution. The Germans had built the Type XXI, the world's first truly modern submarine, capable of running silently underwater for long stretches, faster submerged than most ships could travel on the surface. The Soviets studied it, copied it, and improved it. By the late 1940s, the Whiskey-class and Zulu-class submarines began slipping into the water. They were quieter, faster, deadlier, and numerous. Hundreds were planned, meant to strangle Western sea lanes in a future conflict. To the admirals in Washington and London, this was a nightmare resurrected. The destroyers of World War II had been built to hunt submarines, but those submarines had been crude, slow, and noisy. Now, the prey was faster, stealthier, and potentially armed with nuclear warheads. The oceans, once ruled by surface fleets, were turning into a vast shadow battlefield. The enemy was no longer a ship visible on the horizon. It was a faint sound deep below, a ripple in sonar static, an echo that could vanish as quickly as it appeared. This was the destroyer's new enemy. And it demanded a new kind of courage. Destroyer crews trained endlessly for anti-submarine warfare. They learned to interpret sonar echoes as if listening to heartbeats. A rising pulse meant danger, a fading one might mean escape. Night after night, they ran drills in rough seas, dropping practice depth charges, tracking friendly submarines, simulating attacks. And though they rarely fired a shot, they knew that if war came, theirs would be the first response, and possibly the first losses. By 1950, the Soviet threat had given the destroyer a new purpose. The old gunfighters had found a new duel, not of shells and splashes, but of silence and sound. 5. The human and moral angle, sailors in the age of uncertainty. For the men who served aboard post-war destroyers, life at sea was both familiar and alien. The hulls looked the same, the decks smelled of oil and salt as they always had, but the mission felt hollow. They were trained to fight a war that was over, preparing for another that no one wanted to start. Days were filled with maintenance, drills, and long patrols in featureless seas. The guns were cleaned though few expected to use them. Engines were run, radars tested, logbooks filled, a rhythm of preparation without purpose. Letters home spoke of monotony more than danger. "We steam," one sailor wrote from the destroyer USS Urban in 1948, "and we listen. The sea is quiet, but it feels like it's waiting for something." The new destroyer life was technical, mechanical, and psychological. Crews had to understand radar systems, sonar arrays, communication codes, technologies that had replaced the raw, visible chaos of battle. Young sailors who once dreamed of heroism found themselves operating scopes and switches, guarding against enemies they would never see. Yet beneath the routine was pride. Destroyer men were still the Navy's greyhounds, fast, responsive, self-reliant. They could fight fires, repair engines, and reload guns in storms. Their ships might have been outdated, but their spirit was not. In small ports from Sasebo to Portsmouth, the destroyer was still a symbol of reach and presence, the first ship to arrive, the last to leave. Diplomats could talk about peace, but the thin line of destroyers patrolling distant seas was what truly kept that peace intact. Still, there was a quiet melancholy aboard these ships. Many officers knew they were serving at the end of an era. The great battleships were gone, the carriers were growing into the new giants of naval power, and the whisper of guided missiles was already echoing through research labs. They were, in every sense, the last gunfighters, the final generation of sailors whose ships spoke with the language of steel and fire. And soon, as war broke out once more on the Korean peninsula, they would prove that their time had not yet passed, that the destroyer, despite all predictions, still had one last storm to face. June 25, 1950. At dawn, North Korean artillery opened fire across the 38th parallel. Within hours, tanks and infantry surged south toward Seoul. The Cold War turned hot overnight. In Washington and Tokyo, orders came quickly. The U.S. 7th Fleet was to move immediately. Within days, ships that had been in quiet reserve or routine patrol were recalled to action. Destroyers that had not fired their guns in 5 years were suddenly at war again. The Korean peninsula, a rugged stretch of mountains and coastline, offered no safe front lines. Roads were few, bridges were vital, and coastal supply routes became lifelines. This was a war tailor-made for destroyers, fast, mobile, and capable of striking targets ashore or protecting convoys from air and submarine threats. By July 1950, destroyers like USS Mansfield, DD-728, and USS De Haven, DD-727, were shelling enemy positions along the Korean coast. They targeted troop movements, ammunition dumps, and railway lines that snaked dangerously close to the sea. Every night, the horizon flashed with the thunder of 5-inch guns. The same weapons once aimed at Japanese islands now turned toward the Asian mainland again. Naval gunfire support became essential to the survival of UN forces fighting inland. As North Korean troops pushed toward Pusan, destroyers operated dangerously close to shore, delivering precise bombardments guided by spotter aircraft and ground observers. They became floating artillery batteries, always moving, always exposed. The old destroyers proved their worth once more. Despite being designed for high-seas combat, they adapted easily to the new tactical demands. Their speed allowed them to shift fire support quickly between fronts. Their radar fire control systems, once meant to track aircraft, were now used to hit moving trains and troop concentrations with deadly accuracy. But the war was not without cost. The shallow Korean coastline, filled with hidden reefs and minefields, became a graveyard for the careless. USS Magpie, Gens 25, was sunk by a mine in September 1950. Several destroyers were damaged by coastal batteries hidden in cliffs or fishing villages. Mines, crude but effective, became the most feared enemy. The destroyers' crews learned quickly that this was a war of improvisation. They used binoculars instead of radar when close to shore, gauged ranges by flash and sound, and maneuvered constantly to avoid return fire. They relearned the instincts of naval gunnery, the art of predicting wind, tide, and recoil, the muscle memory of sailors who once fought at Okinawa or Leyte. And then came the Incheon landing, September 15, 1950. It was one of the most daring amphibious operations in history. To clear the way for General Douglas MacArthur's invasion, destroyers led the bombardment, blasting coastal fortifications and navigational obstacles at point-blank range. Their guns opened at dawn, lighting the mudflats with fire and smoke. Marines later said that the accuracy of destroyer gunfire saved hundreds of lives on the beaches that day. When the tide turned, literally and figuratively, destroyers shifted to pursuit, chasing retreating North Korean forces along the coasts, cutting off supply routes and rescuing downed pilots. They became the most visible face of American power in the Far East. But the war's expansion brought new dangers. As Chinese forces entered the conflict in late 1950, coastal air threats re-emerged. Jet aircraft from Manchuria began to patrol near Korean waters, and Soviet-made torpedo boats appeared sporadically along the coastline. Once again, destroyers had to defend themselves, and the carrier task forces, against fast, unpredictable enemies. For many sailors, it felt like a return to the Pacific, only colder, harsher, and lonelier. They fought in freezing seas, their decks coated with ice, their guns firing night after night at unseen targets. The war demanded endurance as much as courage. By early 1951, the pattern was set. The destroyers rotated through constant bombardment duty, carrier escort missions, and radar picket patrols. Some spent over 200 consecutive days at sea. Shore leave was rare, casualties quiet but constant, burns, exhaustion, machinery accidents, frostbite. Yet their performance astonished even their own admirals. Reports from the front described 5-inch guns firing with unbroken precision after thousands of rounds. Commanders praised their accuracy, flexibility, and sheer persistence. For all the talk of obsolescence, the destroyer was once again the fleet's workhorse, the indispensable ship of a new war fought under old principles. As the tide of battle stabilized and armistice talks began, the role of these ships evolved once more. The U.S. Navy realized that if the destroyer could adapt to Korea, it could adapt to anything. But that adaptability came at a cost. The strain of non-stop combat exposed the limits of gun destroyers, their vulnerability to air power, their lack of endurance against jet-age threats, and the growing need for guided weapons. By the end of 1951, plans were already underway to create something entirely new, destroyers that would no longer fight with shells, but with missiles. The last gunfighters had proven themselves one final time. And now, they would be asked to evolve again. The Korean War had reminded the world of something that peace had almost erased: the power of naval fire. Destroyers had shelled beaches, escorted carriers, rescued downed pilots, and patrolled against submarines with tireless precision. They had proven their worth beyond doubt. But the admirals knew a hard truth: the next war would not look like Korea. By 1952, the Cold War was deepening into open rivalry. The Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, and now its submarines, improved Whiskey and Zulu classes, roamed the North Atlantic. The United States and its NATO allies began to understand that the sea would once again become a front line. Only this time, the threat would come from beneath and above, not from the horizon. Conventional destroyers, with their 5-inch guns and depth charges, could no longer meet that challenge alone. They had to change or disappear. The Great Redesign. In the quiet offices of the Bureau of Ships, a new kind of destroyer began to take shape on the drafting tables. It was called the Forrest Sherman class, the first all-new American destroyer design since 1945. Where wartime destroyers had bristled with guns and torpedo tubes, the Sherman was sleek and minimalist. 9 5-inch guns reduced to just 3 dual-purpose mounts, but paired with advanced radar, sonar, and fire control systems. Automation replaced manpower, electronics replaced instinct. Her lines were cleaner, her superstructure lower, her center of gravity balanced for speed and stability. Inside her hull, she carried new depth charge projectors, the Weapon Alpha, a forward-firing anti-submarine rocket system designed to strike fast-diving submarines before they could escape. It was a destroyer still built for the gun era, but ready to step into the missile age. The Royal Navy, facing its own transformation, completed the Daring class, a bold synthesis of old and new. With fully automatic twin 4.5-inch turrets, high-pressure boilers, and advanced radar, they were the last and most sophisticated gun destroyers Britain would ever build. Each nation's approach carried the same message: the destroyer would endure, but its guns would not define it anymore. Missiles, machines, and the future. By 1953, the U.S. Navy's Research and Development Board had begun studying guided missile integration aboard surface ships. The first prototypes, the Terrier and Tartar systems, were bulky and temperamental, but they represented the future. Early plans proposed converting existing destroyers to carry them. The USS Giant DD-712 would become the first testbed, refitted in 1956 as the Navy's first guided missile destroyer, DDG-1. But the roots of that transformation were laid in the early 1950s, in the post-Korea atmosphere of restless innovation. The logic was simple: aircraft had become too fast for gunfire. A jet could close the distance between radar detection and impact in seconds. Even the fastest 5-inch gun could not track it. Missiles, guided by radar and proximity fuses, could. And beneath the surface, nuclear-powered submarines loomed. In 1955, the USS Nautilus began her trials, the world's first atomic submarine. She could stay submerged indefinitely and travel farther than any diesel ship before her. The destroyer's age-old advantage, endurance, was now gone. To survive, it had to become the hunter in the electronic age, not just the gunfighter of the steel one. The human cost of progress. For sailors, this transformation was bittersweet. Many who had fought through World War II and Korea saw their beloved ships vanish into scrapyards. Fletchers, Sumners, Gearings, veterans of every ocean, were decommissioned in waves. Some were preserved in reserve fleets, others were sold to Allied navies under the Mutual Defense Assistance Program. To smaller nations, Turkey, Greece, Taiwan, Japan, these ships were gifts of power and pride. To the Americans who had served on them, they were ghosts of a vanished navy. Inside shipyards, the change was visible. Welding arcs illuminated half-built superstructures designed not for gun mounts but for radar arrays. The smell of grease and cordite gave way to the sterile hum of electrical panels. Sailors trained not in gunnery, but in electronics, radio maintenance, and data plotting. The destroyer's bridge, once filled with shouting, smoke, and brass, became quieter, cooler, filled with screens and switches. The command of steel was turning into the command of circuitry. The last salvos. Between 1953 and 1955, destroyers around the world fired their last great series of gun actions. The Korean truce did not bring peace to the sea, it brought tension. U.S. destroyers patrolled the Taiwan Strait, where communist and nationalist forces exchanged artillery fire across narrow waters. British destroyers escorted convoys through the Suez and the Persian Gulf, protecting oil routes vital to Western economies. Each mission felt like a holdover from another century, the echo of a fading craft. The men who manned those 5-inch guns knew it too. The weapon that had defined their ships was no longer the fleet's first line of defense. It was, increasingly, the last resort. Yet when they fired, the sound still carried a kind of poetry. The recoil, the shockwave, the glowing shells arcing into darkness. It was a ritual of power that had not yet lost its meaning. By 1955, the destroyer's transformation was irreversible. The blueprints for the missile ships of the 1960s were already complete. The world's navies were entering the guided age, and the thunder of naval guns, after half a century of dominance, was fading into memory. The destroyer had survived, but it had been reborn. From the roar of iron and steam to the hum of electronics, it had crossed the bridge between eras, one foot in the past, one firmly in the future. The war had proved the destroyer's worth. The peace would redefine it. The mid-1950s marked the final dividing line between two ages, the age of gunfire and the age of guidance. By 1955, every major navy faced the same question: what would replace the destroyer's thunder? The answer came not in sound, but in silence, in the invisible pulse of radar beams and the whisper of homing sonar. Across the world, shipyards began to reshape the fleets that had survived two global wars. The mighty gun destroyers of the 1940s were either mothballed, transferred, or reborn. Their hulls were solid. Their engines were proven. And though their weapons were outdated, their speed and agility made them perfect platforms for a new purpose: anti-submarine warfare in the nuclear age. The Fram Revolution. In the United States, this rebirth carried a name: FRAM, Fleet Rehabilitation and Modernization. Between 1959 and the mid-1960s, hundreds of World War II-era destroyers were hauled back into dry dock. There, they were stripped down to bare steel and rebuilt from the keel up. New engines, enclosed bridges, sonar domes, radar masts, and electronics bays replaced the familiar lines of the past. Gone were the 5 twin 5-inch mounts that had once defined the Gearing-class silhouette. In their place stood a single aft gun, an enclosed forward mount, and the unmistakable deckhouse for the ASROC launcher, the anti-submarine rocket. ASROC could deliver a torpedo or a depth charge by rocket propulsion to a contact miles away, a concept unthinkable only a decade earlier. And at the stern, a small, retractable hangar housed the Dash drone helicopter, an unmanned aircraft that could carry torpedoes beyond visual range. The destroyer had become something entirely new, half ship, half machine, a fusion of steel, electronics, and automation. The world follows. The transformation was not confined to America. In Britain, post-war austerity forced the Royal Navy to think leaner and faster. The Type 12 frigates, descended from wartime escort designs, took over many of the destroyer's old duties. Yet Britain's modernized darings, refitted with new radar and electronics, lingered on, proud survivors of an age when naval gunnery had ruled the seas. The Soviets, meanwhile, drew their own conclusions. Their experience against Western sea power convinced them that submarines, not battleships, would define future warfare. Yet they, too, built a new class of destroyers, the Kotlin and Kildin classes, hybrids armed with both conventional guns and early anti-ship missiles. Every navy, east or west, was experimenting, improvising, learning in real time. The destroyer, once a simple category of ship, had fragmented into many forms: escorts, frigates, pickets, missile platforms. But their purpose remained the same: to be the fleet's eyes, ears, and shield. The radar pickets. In the nuclear decade, early warning became survival itself. The U.S. Navy converted several destroyers into radar picket ships, part of the long-range detection net that shielded North America and carrier battle groups from Soviet bomber attacks. These ships carried massive radar dishes on tall lattice masts, giving them a profile unlike any warship before. Crews served for long, lonely months at sea, maintaining a silent vigil against attack that never came. It was thankless work, yet it represented the new face of sea warfare. A destroyer's most powerful weapon was no longer its guns or torpedoes, but its ability to detect an enemy before he struck. A shift in power. By the end of the 1950s, the destroyer's role had shifted from hunter to protector. It no longer led attacks. It shielded carriers, tracked submarines, and guided aircraft. And yet, it endured. While cruisers grew fewer and battleships vanished entirely, destroyers multiplied. They became the new backbone of the world's navies, smaller, faster, and infinitely adaptable. Where once they had been judged by the range of their guns, now they were defined by the range of their sensors. The thunder had gone silent, but the mission had never been clearer. From the Atlantic barrier to the Pacific patrols, the destroyer had found its place in the Cold War, no longer the last gunfighter, but the first line of defense in a world of invisible threats. But as the 1960s began, a new chapter was already forming, one that would truly close the age of steel and smoke. The first destroyers with guided missiles were taking shape, their launchers gleaming under floodlights in American and Soviet shipyards alike. The destroyer's transformation was complete. Yet the spirit of those who had fought through the old wars, the sailors who had trusted steel, fire, and courage, still echoed in every hull. Their ships had evolved. Their mission had not. By the mid-1950s, the last generation of gun destroyers was fading from frontline service. Fletchers, Sumners, and Gearings, once the backbone of the U.S. Navy's World War II triumphs, were now either modernized through FRAM programs, transferred to Allied navies, or decommissioned entirely. Yet their impact persisted. Across the Pacific, Asia, and Europe, former U.S. and British destroyers sailed under new flags. The Taiwanese Navy received Fletchers to patrol tense straits, forming the backbone of the island's defense. Greece, Turkey, and South Korea also incorporated these vessels, turning relics into instruments of Cold War deterrence. Even in South America, countries like Argentina and Brazil employed decommissioned American destroyers to project coastal power. These transfers had dual purposes. Politically, they strengthened alliances and extended influence without direct military engagement. Technically, they gave smaller navies access to proven platforms capable of long-range, multi-role operations. A single Fletcher-class destroyer, even in 1956, could escort convoys, provide shore bombardment, conduct anti-submarine patrols, and operate as a command ship, a testament to its design's adaptability. Doctrinal influence. For NATO planners, The lessons of the last gunfighters were invaluable. Cold War naval strategy increasingly emphasized flexibility over firepower, detection over confrontation, and survivability over offensive weight. Destroyers were no longer measured by the number of guns or torpedoes, but by their ability to integrate into fleet networks, radar, sonar, and communication systems linking them to carriers, submarines, and aircraft. The Soviet Union, watching these innovations, responded with its own fleet transformations. Kotlin-class destroyers and early guided missile ships mirrored the Western shift: smaller, faster, equipped with advanced electronics, and tasked with layered defense rather than pure gun battles. In this way, the last gunfighters shaped the entire trajectory of Cold War naval doctrine. They bridged the gap between the overwhelming firepower of World War II and the precision, detection-driven warfare of the nuclear age. Cultural and human legacy. For the sailors who had served aboard these ships, the period left lasting impressions. The shift from gunfire to electronics required new skills. Radar operators replaced gunners, sonar specialists replaced torpedo teams. Yet the ethos of the destroyer, speed, agility, and relentless vigilance, endured. Veterans often recalled the last salvos with reverence. There was a ceremonial quality to firing a gun in the 1950s, a connection to the past that honored decades of naval tradition. Even as missile systems began to dominate, the sight of a 5-inch round leaving the barrel reminded crews of the courage, skill, and improvisation their predecessors had relied upon during the Second World War and Korea. The destroyer had become a symbol of continuity amid rapid technological change, a vessel that carried forward the lessons, discipline, and resilience of the past while adapting to a future few could fully imagine. The symbolic closure. By 1960, the era of the gun destroyer had effectively ended. Ships designed and built for naval artillery were no longer leading fleet actions. They were auxiliary, experimental, or ceremonial. The guided missile destroyers and frigates of the new decade took their place, embodying the principle that technology could outpace tradition, yet tradition remained vital in shaping how navies thought, trained, and fought. The last gunfighters had taught one final lesson: that adaptability, not size or firepower alone, determined survival. Destroyers evolved, fleets reorganized, and the oceans themselves became laboratories for the doctrines of the Cold War. And so, the world's navies moved forward, guided by the ghosts of the past. The roar of naval guns was replaced by the hum of radar, the quiet thrum of sonar, and the distant launch of missiles. But in every hull, in every bridge, the spirit of the gunfighter endured, a reminder of steel, courage, and the relentless heartbeat of the fleet. The destroyer's story is one of evolution as much as endurance. From the roar of World War II to the silence of radar pickets, from the frozen coasts of Korea to the quiet patrols of the Cold War, these ships carried forward a legacy that was both human and technological. They were never the largest, nor the most celebrated. Battleships commanded headlines. Carriers projected power. Yet destroyers were the fleet's lifeblood, versatile, relentless, and often invisible. They patrolled, protected, and fought in ways that few outside their decks would ever see. They were the soldiers of the sea, enduring storms, silence, and uncertainty with equal measure. The post-war years transformed them. Guns gave way to electronics. Depth charges evolved into guided rockets. Radar replaced instinct. And still, the men who served aboard these ships carried the same ethos as their World War II predecessors: courage, discipline, and a willingness to act when the unseen enemy appeared. In this transformation lies the destroyer's greatest lesson. Survival required adaptation. The world had changed. The atomic bomb, jet aircraft, and nuclear submarines had rewritten the rules of engagement. Yet the destroyer, once thought obsolete, found a new purpose. Its steel hulls became platforms for innovation. Its decks, stages for a different kind of war. The last gunfighters were not just vessels, but symbols. They bridged two eras, the age of visible battle and the age of invisible threats. They remind us that progress does not erase the past, but builds upon it. The roar of 5-inch guns may have faded, but their impact, on sailors, on strategy, on the course of naval history, endures. As missiles replaced shells and computers guided operations, the spirit of the destroyer persisted, fast, adaptable, and unyielding. It is a story of courage that outlasted steel, of human ingenuity that outpaced weapons, and of a fleet that always found a way to remain relevant even when the world thought it obsolete. The last gunfighters are gone from frontline service. But their legacy sails on, in every destroyer, every sonar pulse, every radar sweep, and every sailor who steps onto the deck, ready to face the unknown. The sea changed. The ships changed. But the heart of the destroyer, its speed, its courage, its relentless vigilance, remained eternal.